I'm Dr. David Bernstein. Welcome back to our series, 25 Tips for Working with Modes. Now, last time we talked about how to do the little things to try to help people to build their strengths. And today we're going to go further with our topic of strengths because we're going to discuss how to integrate an approach focusing on strengths with an approach that works on modes. And that brings us to the topic for today, do the tango. How do you tango with modes and strengths? Now, the tango, I have to confess, I'm a terrible dancer. I don't know how to dance the tango. I probably will never be able to either. And yet, it's really a thing of beauty to watch. And when it comes to working with modes and strengths, you're doing a kind of tango. You are involved in a flowing movement back and forth that, pivots one direction and pivots the other direction. And sometimes you're focusing on strengths and sometimes you're focusing on modes. And it really is like doing a dance that includes both. And how does this tango with strengths and modes work? Well, here's the important point. When we introduce strengths in therapy, when we start to assess people's strengths, we start to talk with people about their strengths, start to encourage people to, grab their strengths and use their strengths, usually this induces a positive mood in people, to feel, hey, I'm good at this and I can do that. It usually leaves people in a good mood. And you really notice that, how people perk up when you talk about their strengths. And that's also one of the reasons why it's so helpful, to, include strengths in our approach, because, that, sense of positive energy, is part of mobilizing the person's healthy adult mode to take concrete actions, in the right direction. However, one of the things that we notice is that sometimes when you introduce strengths, that it can also trigger modes. And if that's the case, then it doesn't induce a positive mood. It has other effects. So let's say you're talking with somebody about their strengths and, they're kind of nodding their head, yes, yes, but it doesn't really seem to sink in, So there may be other kinds of reactions that people have when you bring up strengths. And usually the reason for that is because talking about strengths and working on strengths can sometimes trigger people's modes. Now, in our experience, for people who are relatively healthier, usually, focusing on strengths has a beneficial effect on one's mood. But oftentimes it's when people have, more serious problems, let's say people who have more severe personality disorders. There is where we often see people have a hard time accepting the fact that they have strengths, or it can even, result in some kind of, negative reactions. So, let's talk a little bit about, how this works, because the idea here is that if you are focusing on strengths, and it induces some kind of negative reaction, if somebody flips into a mode, then that's where the idea of the tango comes in, because then you shift direction from working on strengths to working on modes. So it's a kind of fluid dance back and forth between the two. So let's take an example. Let's go back to our example of Ron, the case that we've been working on now for a while. The young man who gets into these repeating fights with his girlfriend. As we talked about, Ron has a number of strengths, and the main ones that we identified are strengths in the area of connection. Empathy and compassion and humor. So these are all very nice qualities that Ron has. And we noted that it's sort of ironic that, he's really not able to use these very effectively in his relationship with his girlfriend. So imagine now that we start talking with Ron about his strengths. And imagine you get a reaction, kind of like, yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, I do have these, but, I'm really not so empathetic. With my girlfriend, oftentimes I'm not empathetic at all. And, I'm not always so fun to be with. Okay, this is a kind of yes, but reaction. And it's an indication that Ron has gotten triggered. Okay, that some kind of mode has gotten triggered. And maybe in this case, it's Ron's inner critic mode, his punitive parent mode. This is something that we see sometimes, you could say it's hard for these people to take a compliment. And instead, it provokes a kind of negative self-critical reaction. So how do you deal with that? Well, in schema therapy, the idea is you follow the mode. When there is a mode switch, you adjust your intervention in order to focus on the mode that was just activated. And so here, what we would want to do then is to, do that tango dance and make that shift from focusing on Ron's strengths to focusing on his inner critic mode. So you might do an intervention like an empathic confrontation. You might just say to him something like, hey, Ron, did you just notice something? We were talking about your strengths. And then I see a side of you, the side of you that, I've often seen in here, a side of you that feels like, you're just not doing it well enough. And, you kind of gave a little lip service to the fact that you've got these strengths, but really, I hear that inner critic voice of yours that says, no, you're wrong. Ron isn't good enough. Don't make such a big deal out of his strengths. He's really messing up. And I think this is a side of you, Ron, that's gotten triggered right now by talking about your strengths. And from there, of course, you could do any number of interventions. For example, you could do a role play where you would put Ron's inner critic mode on an empty chair and, talk to that side about, how does that side feel about the fact that, Ron's therapist is complimenting him and pointing out his strengths. And then you could do things to counteract, that negative critical voice of Ron's. Okay, so here's one example again of how you can kind of flow seamlessly from focusing on strengths to focusing on modes. Okay. Now, it turns out that we can incorporate a strengths-focused approach into any technique that we use for working with modes. For example, you can incorporate strengths into role-playing. You can incorporate strengths into imagery rescripting. There really are endless number of variations on this. And why do we do this? Because what we want to do is to help people to achieve greater integration, right? That, we all have our modes, our weaker points, and we all have our strengths, right? We all have our more dysfunctional sides, and we also have, the characteristics that contribute to our healthy adult side. And what we want to do is to help people to integrate those two. We don't want people to deny or neglect their modes, but we don't want to make the modes the exclusive focus also. We want people to be able to, bring their positive qualities into their conscious sense of self, right? So that both modes and strengths play a part in a person's sense of who they are in an integrated way. Now let's give an example of how this would work. Let's say after working with Ron, on his angry outbursts, toward his girlfriend, let's say that we do some imagery with him, at a moment when, he gets triggered and gets angry at her or feels angry at her, usually at those moments when he feels that she's being controlling or demanding toward him. And let's say what we find is that underneath that, there is a lonely side of Ron, a side of him that really never got the connection that he needed. And, for him, maybe growing up, maybe, he grew up with, a parent who was over controlling, wasn't really focused on his own needs, and instead placed a lot of excessive demands upon him. And so, maybe what's underneath those moments of anger where he feels it's unfair and she's making, too many demands on him, is a lonely side, a side of him that never really felt that, acknowledged, or a side of him that really never felt that there was a focus on his needs growing up as a child, So a side of him underneath the anger that can feel quite lonely, and neglected. Well, okay, so imagine now you're doing an imagery exercise and, you've started with a present situation, like, one of Ron's fights with his girlfriend, and then you go and follow that feeling that gets triggered in that moment and take it back to the past. And let's say you end up with this lonely child mode. Well, what we do in schema therapy then is typically as therapists, we go in there into that image and try to provide for, some of what that little child missed growing up. And here we can also bring in Ron's strengths, because one of the things that we can do, is we can ask him to take some of the qualities that he has and use them to the benefit of that vulnerable child within him. Let's say by this point in the therapy, we've already been talking about the fact that Ron has these qualities of empathy and compassion. Then when we're back there with that little child, we can basically, talk to big Ron and say to him, hey, Ron, can you direct some empathy to that little child inside of you? What is that little child needing? And direct some compassion to that little child. And by doing that, what Ron is able to do is to use his strengths in order to provide for his own emotional needs. Because what was missing growing up was not only autonomy, that his autonomy needs weren't being respected, it was also connection. So if Ron can use his capacity for empathy and compassion and direct those toward that vulnerable side of himself, really feel and experience what he missed growing up, and have some, compassion and some desire to alleviate the suffering of, that he experienced and that deep inside of himself he still feels. Maybe that's the beginning of helping him to actually get some of his own needs for connection met. Okay, so here is an example of how you could take imagery rescripting, something that we frequently do in schema therapy, and incorporate an explicit approach using strengths to help the patient, give himself more of what he needs. Okay. Now there are endless variations on that. You can also use a strengths approach, following an exercise like I just described, to do some future imagery. Maybe then, Ron is trying to imagine a situation where, in the future, the same situation occurs with his girlfriend where she wants him to stay home and he wants to go out, and to take a moment and get in touch with that vulnerable side of himself and to use his strengths. So we can also use it for future imagery. Okay, so there are a variety of ways in which we can then combine strengths with modes in an integrated way, that can really help the patient to grow and to thrive. Okay. So today we talked about how to do the tango, how to do a dance that, goes back and forth between modes and strengths and, ends up achieving greater integration and satisfaction of needs. Now, next time, what I'd like to do is to talk about, what is the relative or respective role of the patient and the therapist, in a therapy that focuses on strengths and a therapy that tries to foster strengths. What is the respective roles of the client and the therapist? Who is the change agent here? Is it the client? Is it the therapist? And in which way? And that'll bring us to the tip for tomorrow. For next time, more is less and less is more. And please come to our website, www.imodes.com, and take a look at our image-based therapy tools. Have a great week and see you next time.